Thanks, Stephanie. So this week we're continuing and kind of finishing off this chunk of scripture that we've been talking about that's dealing with food sacrifice to idols. And so here, today we're looking at, Paul kind of shifts gears, right? Like he's been talking about in Corinth, they've been going to the temples, to the pagan temples, and they've been participating in the feasts there. And last week we looked at Paul, sort of how Paul corrects their attitude and how he shifts them from thinking, okay, so is this really something that's beneficial, right? Is this something that's building up your brother and sister? Because the issue was that for some in their congregation, that was a big stumbling block. And so Paul was trying to change their attitude to get people to think about, well, how is my actions, my conduct, how does that impact the conscience of others in the congregation? And so it's this principle of the stumbling block. So that's what Paul was dealing with last week. And this week, in this continuation, he kind of he deals with it from a different angle, where it wasn't just that going to these pagan temples and participating in the meals there, that Paul doesn't just consider this a disputable matter. It's not a matter of indifference. But Paul actually here in today's passage highlights that there's more going on when you go into the temples and you participate in the sacrifice that's there. And he sort of draws these analogies. And so in today's passage, he talks, first he kind of goes looking at the Old Testament, and he sort of highlights some warnings from ancient Israel, right, that he sort of draws on, especially the wilderness generation, right? Just after they had come, God had delivered them and brought them out of Egypt, and then they sort of wandered around and they were disobedient, they grumbled a lot, and so he draws some lessons from there. And then he gets to the sort of the meat of this passage where he deals with them participating in the temple worship, these pagan temples. And at this point, he says that this is idolatry. And it's not compatible with life as a Christ follower. So this is, on the one hand, Paul sort of is very flexible and he can sort of deal with different situations and realize that the context. But then in this particular case, he highlights that this goes too far. And so he comes down very strongly against us participating in the temple meals. And then at the end of this chapter, he sort of shifts gears again and he deals with eating marketplace food, right? So food that may have come from the temples, may have been butchered by a priest, but then is not eaten in the temple context as part of a sacrificial meal, but is just eaten in the home. And here he says, well, then it matters, who you're eating it with, what questions are raised. So like in these chapters, Paul is really dealing with how we are to live our lives as Christ followers and think about the other. And so he's kind of dealing with these disputable matters that we face, and our disputable matters are going to be different in our culture than 2,000 years ago. But then also, at what point does something shift from being a disputable matter or a matter of indifference to being an absolute? And so it's a good case study in this regard. And then at the end, he just provides some concluding exhortations that wraps up this whole, 3 chapters of Corinthians. So first he gives some warnings, okay? And he sort of highlights and he makes this analogy with ancient Israel, right? And this is sort of typology it's referred to. And he says that the Israelites, right, the ancient Israelites, like the Corinthians, were united through a common experience of deliverance through water, right? He refers to the exodus from Egypt as his baptism when they went through the Red Sea. In the same way how the Christ followers at Corinth were baptized, right? And then he also then talks about how they ate the same spiritual food. And then here he's drawing an allusion, an analogy with communion. And so he's making this general kind of connection with the ancient Israelites and their current practice. And so he highlights here that in the same way that the Israelites, and if you read those stories, at the end of the book of Exodus and in the book of Numbers, you see again and again how they grumbled, how they sort of had factionalism, how they divided over, they didn't trust their leaders, and there's all this sort of issues, and also things like idolatry and sexual immorality, all these sorts of issues. And he says that the Israelites too experienced this same sort of stuff that the Corinthian church was experiencing, and they faced God's judgment. And so this is a strong warning that Paul's giving them. He says, guys, you need to really think about what you're doing, and that participating in going to the temples and eating and feasting there has more implications than maybe you think. And as well as some of the other divisions that we've heard about all throughout this letter. And then, so he gives us general analogy at first, and then he sort of gives some specific, where he appeals to particular passages in the Old Testament. And he does this through typology. And he says, now these things occurred as examples, is the way the NIV translates it. In Greek, it's tupos, it's type. These things were types to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And he also repeats this at the end of this section in verse 11. But typology is where you make a connection, and this is something you find throughout the New Testament, that the different New Testament authors will use typology, where you make a connection with a person or a place or a thing or an event or an institution in the Old Testament, and you apply it by analogy to something in the New Testament, something in the life of the church. And so this is something which you see happen frequently, and this is specifically what Paul is doing here. And he uses this method of typology, of making this connection and saying, we need to learn from what happened to the ancient Israelites, to our ancestors, to the people of God in the Old Testament times. We need to learn from their example so that we don't go down the same path. And so he gives 4 specific warnings. And this is something which I have to admit, I get fascinated about stuff like this, because he's quoting these passages in the Old Testament. Usually he's quoting them in the Greek, right? So he's talking about the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint translation, and there's all these textual issues and what exactly he's referring to, and I get all excited about that, but I won't bore you with all those details. If you want to talk about some of this stuff, I'd be happy to, and give you more than your fill of it. But I just want to sort of highlight some of the main points here. And so the first one, of course, that he appeals to is the sort of the example par excellence within the Old Testament of idolatry is the golden calf incident. Right here you have the Israelites are delivered from Egypt. God led them out of Egypt with a mighty arm, and they go to Mount Sinai, and they're waiting there because Moses is up on the mountain getting 10 Commandments. And no sooner than Moses was gone is that they were kind of getting bored, and they were thinking, well, Moses is gone, let's make an idol. Always a good thing to do. No. Okay, so this is the example par excellence. And so here, Paul highlights this. He says, do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. And so the particular quote from Exodus 32 that Paul gives is notice that how it highlights not sort of the making of the golden calf or anything like that, but it highlights their participation and their eating and drinking in association with this idolatry, right? So he's making this connection with what's going on at Corinth at that time. And so that's the first example that he gives. And then he draws another example, and this is where you have this sexual immorality of the Israelites. They were wandering in the desert, and they sort of got into a little bit of issues with the Midianites, right? And so it's a specific case where they started worshiping Baal Peor, which is one of the Canaanite gods that was very common and was always a thorn in Israel's flesh at that time. And so Paul cites then from Numbers 25, and he says that we should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. And so he's, again, showing the consequences of idolatry and sexual immorality, which are often associated in the Old Testament and even within Judaism at the time of Paul and Jesus. And there seems to be something going on, even when they go to the pagan temples to feast, that, some thought that a lot of the worship of the pagan temples in Greco-Roman times involved also sexual play and things like that. So it's just full of these bad associations. And then he gives another third example where he talks about testing God. He says we should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. Okay, and this probably is referring to Numbers 21, where they were grumbling, and what were they grumbling about? Well, food and water and this sort of stuff, which is connected again with the context of Corinth. They were grumbling about that, and they were putting God to the test, and then God sent snakes and killed them, and it's the whole thing. And I'm not going to get into all the issues of how we understand judgment and how God judged back in the Old Testament times. But I will say that right now is this time of grace where we're all invited and called to come to God, and judgment is something which is yet future. But this is another example where they were grumbling, they were testing God, they were being unfaithful, and then they were judged. And then the final one is again, a little obscure. It says, and do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. If you try to find exactly what Paul is referring to here, you don't find it, right? Like there's no reference in all the grumbling that the wilderness generation did in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. And there's lots of that, lots of different examples that you could appeal to. There's no case where it explicitly refers to the destroying angel, killing them. So it seems that most people think this is a general reference, like it talks about in the Exodus and later on with David and in Chronicles, it refers to this destroying angel. And the idea here is just, this is how God carries out judgment, right? Is through his destroying angel, through the angel of death, this sort of stuff. So Paul makes these 4 warnings, these 4 sort of appeals to the Old Testament and specifically the wilderness generation. And the main point is to flee from such idolatry. And it's significant that all of these incidents that he refers to are associated with idolatry, associated with sexual immorality, factionalism, and food. The exact things that Paul has been dealing with, not only in these 3 chapters, but also in chapter 6 and in chapter 4 and 3 throughout the book of Corinthians. And so he's dealing with all these issues, and he's saying that they need to learn from the example, from this wilderness generation, and that they need to flee from idolatry, and they need to not be arrogant. And so it's a little bit of a gut check where he says, so if you think you're standing firm, if you think you're impervious to all this sort of stuff that's going on and that you can go to the pagan temples and you can participate in the meals there and it's not going to, harm you, well, he says, be careful that you don't fall. And so this passage, sort of, you can see how it builds up. And Paul, I think, is sort of frustrated with them. And, they've been criticizing him, criticizing his approach. They've been sort of, living in ways that probably are not good and that are causing division in their church and in their congregation. And now he's sort of, hit the wall and he's saying, guys, you need to pay attention. And then he transitions in verse 13 and verse 14 to this next section where he deals directly with the idolatry of going to these pagan temples. But first he gives this verse, which is a much-loved verse, which I assume that most of us know and maybe have memorized. Right? In verse 13, it says, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to humankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." Now, this is a favorite verse, from Corinthians. One of many, but it is one that, that I assume many of you have heard of. One of the challenges in our regular interpretation of it and how it's applied is that it's generally taken right out of context. Right? So I do want to kind of put it back in the context of Corinthians, to help us understand why Paul mentions this exactly here. And the thing is, in this context, he's not talking about general suffering. Right? There's memes that kind of go around how God will not give you more than you can bear in life. Okay? And I think that's not what this passage is referring to. That's taking something that's referring specifically to temptations to sin and applying it to everything that we might face in life. And I don't think that's healthy to do that. So that's misquoting it and taking it out of context. But so it's not this idea, some saccharine sort of idea of God will not give you more than you can handle. But it's about temptation to idolatry, temptation to divisiveness, temptation to grumbling, temptation to break the covenant that you made with our God. And so, on the one hand, it's a reminder of God's faithfulness, right? That God is faithful. And even when we are tempted to break covenant, when we are tempted to sin, to go our own way, to live our lives, to whatever it might be in our context, that this passage highlights that God is faithful and that He will provide an exit path. He will provide us a way to endure the temptation. And what's significant in this particular case with the Corinthians is that, the way out for them is not looking for a way in to participate, not COVID, to participate, but just I need a drink of water, but to participate in these pagan feasts. And so he's saying that, in one way he's saying to them, guys, you know what? I will provide a way out. If I know you're tempted, I know it's good for business associations, for connections in your culture, but there's really a simple solution in this case. Don't go. Right? And he then sort of highlights right after this, and he says, therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. You don't need to go to these pagan temples and participate in the feasts there. Just don't do it. And this is the way out that God has provided them. And so when he shifts gears there, he provides a second argument about why they shouldn't participate. So it's sort of irrelevant of the whole question of how your actions impact your brother and sister in Christ, which is important that he talked about last week. But now he says, think of what impact it has on your own spiritual life by doing this. And so he implies that there's more to going to these feasts than just eating, that there's something else going on. And he draws this connection, and he provides two illustrations. One of them is with communion, with the practice of the Lord's Supper. And he says that there's this special connection, and he uses the Greek word koinonia, right, which is this Greek word that highlights the communion. That's why we call the Lord's Supper communion. The communion that we have when we come together to remember the death of Jesus, and that when we take the bread and when we eat the cup, take the cup and eat the bread, right? That there's something that happens that's both a vertical level with God, right, where we identify with Christ in his death, both as a source of our reconciliation with God, as well as an example of how we should live in the world. Right? But then it also highlights this horizontal connection, that we're brothers and sisters in Christ. That when we come to Christ, that we're incorporated into his body. And so there's something, when we celebrate communion, it's not just a mere symbol that we, when we take the cup and when we take the bread, but there's more going on. There's this spiritual communion between God and between one another. And then he also draws an illustration from the Old Testament, from where he talks about their sacrificial system. And when an ancient Israelite, when they would go to the temple and they would sacrifice an animal for their sin, that this again was participating, that you would put your hand on the animal and sort of make this identification with it as it was sacrificed. And then there would also be eating that you would, depending on the type of sacrifice, that you would, some of it would be burnt off as an offering to God, but then others would be eaten and shared with those that came along with you. And so there's this sense that, both in communion and the Lord's Supper, and then when he looks at the Old Testament, their sacrificial system, that there's more going on than just merely eating. And then he sort of connects the dots for them, and he applies it to their situation. And he says, guys, when you go to the temples, with these pagan temples, and you participate in their feasts, that more is going on than meets the eye. And he says, it's not about the food, right? Earlier in last week, he said, no, all food is good, right? That's not the issue. And he says it's not even about the idols, right? That we recognize there's only one true God. But then he sort of highlights and says that there's this reality of demonic presence at these pagan sacrifices. And here he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 17, and he's quoting from the Septuagint, from the Greek, where he says, the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons. So it's not just benign, but there's, something more going on. And they're not sacrificed to God. And his point is that he doesn't want them to be participating and be participants with demons. And by eating the meals at the pagan temples, that they were participants in the sacrifices. So they weren't doing the sacrifices themselves. Maybe they had no intention that they were going there, and they recognized that, no, I worship, God. The one true God is revealed in Jesus Christ. But sorry, I'm just kind of, let's put it over there. But that they were still somehow, by being there, being in that association, that they were sort of putting themselves in this situation that they shouldn't be. Now, for us in North America, we don't talk about the devil a whole lot. We don't talk about demons. We probably don't think, of the presence of, demonic influence in our everyday life a whole lot. Okay, and that's something which is sort of on us a little bit in a very secular sort of Western worldview. Okay, that in other places in the world, in the two-thirds world, they see the reality of this a little bit more. But when we read the Gospels, when we understand the Scripture and what it says about the devil is very real, a personal, malevolent force in this world. But we have to remember, and I think this is important too, that we have to remember that Jesus, in his victory on the cross, has disabled these demonic forces and liberated people from their influence. Right? So that do not have, it's nothing for us to be scared of or be overly concerned with. In Colossians 1:13, Paul says, "And having disarmed the powers and authorities, that Jesus made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." And then in 2:15, he says, and then in 1 John 3:8, he says, "The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the devil's work." So I'm not saying that we should be overly concerned with the reality of the demonic. We need to kind of keep it in balance and realize that Jesus Christ and his death on the cross and his resurrection, that he has disarmed and has defeated Satan. But nonetheless, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't avoid situations where there still could be demonic influence. And in the first century Corinth, going to the pagan temples where they're intentionally performing sacrifices to these pagan gods, that was an example of an influence that Paul is saying that you shouldn't be associated with that. And as I mentioned already, Western Christians, we need to learn that the demonic is not as remote as we would wish to believe. And there's this balance there. And I always think of C.S. Lewis's quote in the preface to the Screwtape Letters, right? Where he says, "There are two equal and opposite errors which our race can fall into about the devils or about demons. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them." And so somewhere between that is where we need to find ourselves. But I think that in this case, Paul was highlighting that when they were going to those pagan temples, that it wasn't just a matter of indifference. Oh, I have that quote on a slide. You can read it for yourself, sorry. Page 9 in the preface to the Screwtape Letters. So he concludes then at this section. And so just to review, in chapter 8, he argued that the followers of Christ should not go to the pagan temples to participate in the ritual feast. And there his motivation, the guide for them, is because a concern to act in love for one's weaker brother and sister. So that's still a concern for all of our behavior. But then in this chapter, he highlights and he adds an additional argument to his prohibition that in so doing is in fact idolatrous, that you're opening yourself up to sharing in the table of demons, as he says. And so this is sort of how he sort of concludes this section. So, he would say that participation in the feasts in the pagan temples is incompatible with being a Christ follower. So they shouldn't do it. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons, he says in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 21. Now, the challenge, of course, for us in our culture, what does this mean? Right? Again, that I don't think that we should be blind to the reality of the demonic in our world. But on the other hand, we shouldn't look for it everywhere or see it everywhere as well. So after now establishing that, he now changes gears once again, and he deals with this idea of marketplace food. Okay, so he says that no, you shouldn't go to these pagan temples. Okay, everyone's clear on that. Paul, thumbs down on going to the pagan temples and participating in the food there. But when it comes to marketplace food, here he's talking about meat that may very well come from the temple, but was purchased in the market and was eaten at someone's home, or maybe you're invited to someone's place and you eat it in their domicile. And in this case, here he says that it is not something which he prohibits 100%. But what he does at the very beginning of this is highlight the principle that he established earlier in chapter 8. And he rephrases it, and he says that he wants him to start thinking, in this case of eating marketplace food, he wants him to think about what it does for their weaker brother or sister. And he says, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So he applies this general principle. So in the matters of marketplace food, he says, it depends. Right? And then he goes on and he talks about that if you're about to eat this food and someone mentions that, oh yeah, by the way, this was sacrificed to a pagan deity or a god, a Corinthian god at that time, then at that point you probably shouldn't eat it. Right? Because of the conscience of the person that mentioned it and maybe someone that you're with. And so here, this is where Paul is distinguishing between absolutes or essentials and non-essentials or disputable matters. Right? So going to the temples and eating there, he said that is an absolute. That's something that is not just a non-essential, as some of them were thinking, because it's a form of idolatry. But in terms of marketplace food, he's saying that this is a disputable matter, and in that case, it depends on the context and who you're eating it with. So Paul allowed for eating marketplace food unless it caused someone to stumble. And he highlights, this general idea, these principles that he already established in chapter 8, where he says, no one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So as Christians, we need to think about others in terms of our conduct. And then in verse 32, he highlights this stumbling block principle again, where he says, do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God. And this is much the same as what he talks about in Romans 14 and 15. So this is an important distinction that Paul makes here. And of course, the challenge for us is it's not always clear what is a disputable matter and what is an essential. And that's where the hard work needs to happen. And so a couple of conclusions then for today. First, in terms of temptation, that we need to trust God's faithfulness to give a way out from the temptation and sin. That there's many, this is something that for many of us, we will have our different temptations. There are different things that we struggle with. And so I think we need to hang on, to that verse that highlights that God is faithful and that he will give you a way out. But, on the other hand, we need to take the way out that God provides. That we shouldn't put God to the test and to continue to put ourselves in situations, that will, lead us to give in to temptation. So it's a very practical thing that Paul highlights here. That if X tempts you, then try not to be in situations where you're going to have and be confronted by that temptation. The other thing, and as I highlighted too, is that we need to learn to discern the difference between disputable matters and these essentials and absolutes. Right? And here in these 3 chapters, Paul, makes that distinction. He says food doesn't matter. That food sacrifice, the idols don't matter because they're not real. But then he does make this distinction that going to the pagan temples where they're literally sacrificing the meat to a pagan deity and then eating it, that there's something more going on. And so the challenge is in our context, how do you discern that difference? And I think it's important that it is talking about discernment because Paul was very flexible, right? As we saw last week, right? To the Jew, I became a Jew to save the Jews. To the Greek, I became Greek. To the weak, I became weak. That Paul was very flexible in his conduct and how he lived his life among different people in different contexts, and that it is a matter of discernment, that he's not talking about legalism, that there's no one hard and fast rule that's going to fit in every situation. And so we need to sort of understand the context and then apply it, to our context and our situation. And then I think the big point from these 3 chapters, and from really the whole book of Corinthians, is that in all things we are called to follow the self-sacrificial way of Christ's love and concern for others. That should be our guiding point when we are considering how we live our lives in this world. And as Paul concludes, he says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. And how do you do it for the glory of God? Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. And as Paul says at the end of this passage, that we are to follow his example as he follows the example of Christ. Amen.